Hey, it's Professor Wham. It's been a while. Um, it's been a while. It's been at least since June since I've recorded anything, and probably 6 months since I recorded anything remotely about paranormal stuff. So I know it. It's been a while. Like many people, I've been dealing with too much work. I've also been dealing with quite a bit of depression and some health issues, so um, it's made it difficult for me to get my brain together to do this. But I have been reading and trying to organize some things, so I thought I'd put together another one of my reviews of an older text that some of you might find interesting. This text is difficult to get. I think that there might be some PDFs available online, but right now it's selling for about $150 on Amazon or A-Books. When I got it, which was about a year ago, it was much less than that. So apparently somebody's been reading it. I don't remember exactly now where I got the reference for this book, but it turned out to be a good one. A reference that, despite some of its flaws in this book, I can recommend it. So this book is called Omens of Awareness by David Tansley. It was first published in 1977. I believe that there was another printing of the book that was done a few years after that. So there's like a different cover. And I think it's not this is a mass market paperback. And I think that the other book's more of a trade size, but it hasn't been reprinted lately. So some viewers who are more esoterically minded or into certain modalities of holistic healing may recognize David Tansley's name. In other places, he's called David V Tansley. He was the author of a number of books on energy healing, and created, at least the title of a couple of his books are called Radionics, which is kind of a combination, his own combination of chiropractic, plus Indian and some Chinese energy techniques. He was very much into certain esoteric Indian and Chinese modalities of healing. He died relatively young in 1988. I think he was at the age he was in his 50s, late 50s, early 60s perhaps. He was also well versed or heavily schooled, as you might think about it, in the Alice Bailey branch of Theosophy. And as the book itself evidences, he had a fair understanding of Hermetic occultism as well. So he was fairly widely read in a number of, I guess you would say, alternative religious spiritual texts. Now, Omens of Awareness is the only text he wrote about paranormal topics. And according to him, the main reason why he wrote the book, and he talks about this in his preface, was to bridge what he considered to be the gap between the experiences of individuals claiming events of high strangeness — he doesn't obviously use that term — and mystical esoteric traditions, which often display some of the same reported experiences. And he notes, again, he's writing in 1977, he notes that Jacques Vallée in particular, had already kind of figured this out. So he is aware of literature that's being produced around him at the time. Now, Tansley had also apparently accumulated quite a collection of personal accounts from other witnesses himself. And as the book shows, he is pretty familiar with at least most of the best known abduction and contact cases. And actually some unusual ones too. So his book is interesting to read. And he had had a couple of experiences himself, so he wanted to make a public record of them. So the book combines things that had been published with experiences that he collected, as well as some of his own experiences. So that makes the book kind of interesting. So as a result, while he does summarize a wide variety of stories from already published accounts, he also provides first-person accounts that had never been published, and probably never were again. And some of these accounts are valuable, as we shall see. So based on all of his data and experiences at the time of writing, Tansley had come to a conclusion about the meaning and significance of the UFO phenomenon. And he pretty much tells the reader up front what this is. Basically, in short, while there may be many different points of origin for specific experiences, he doesn't deny the possibility that some experiences may be as a result of extraterrestrial contact, for example. The sum total of the phenomenon as a whole is, he basically says, is precisely what Vallée has been telling us, namely the purpose is to awaken human consciousness to the larger realities which surround it and from which it comes. As he says in his introduction, that the initial inspiration for the book came when he read Blumrich's book, The Spaceships of Ezekiel. And that's what first gave him the idea that perhaps these experiences were mystical experiences. He did, however, disagree with some of the literalistic interpretations of Blumrich's theories and speculations about Ezekiel's visions. And so, in many ways, his own research and his own decision to write this book, based on the things he had collected, came out of a sense that he needed to disprove, essentially, what Blumrich was saying. So that's kind of his, he wants to give his own 2 cents worth, if you will. That's pretty much what he's about. So sometimes this awareness, this greater awareness that he thinks the UFO experience is pointing to, must be done forcibly. And in most cases, he does acknowledge that the experiences can contain not only actual physical events or effects, but highly symbolic content, which can be understood if one is familiar with similar kinds of reports throughout human history, and if you're familiar with a wide variety of mystical religious experiences and mystical religious texts. So after making this focus of his work and the conclusions clear, Tansley then spends the rest of his text illustrating this with many examples. And his book is kind of discursive, it's not, I would say it's the most organized text in the world. He kind of goes from topic to topic to topic based on his own interest and his own observations. So if you're looking for a real linear book here, you're not going to find it. Now, I could be exhaustive about his experiences, but I'm only going to provide a couple of examples of interesting things that he talks about, and then go on to some criticisms, which are the normal kinds of criticisms that one might make about such endeavors, before more than strongly hinting that you might want to read this book. It's got a lot of interesting things in it. First, it is clear that Tansley has, in fact, done his research. His text displays a good working knowledge of a wide range of mystical, religious, occult, early New Age, and psychological texts, ranging from Jung and Wilhelm Reich to the Upanishads. He particularly likes the Katha Upanishad. Theosophy, I've already mentioned, especially the Alice Bailey version thereof. From Golden Dawn to Edgar Cayce, Buckminster Fuller to Cathy, that's the New Zealand Army Air Force officer that developed this theory about a grid that he overlaid on the Earth, on a map of the Earth in order to try to predict where UFOs would land. And he believed he had discovered the mathematical key to understanding why UFOs seem to show up in certain places all the time. And David Tansley actually has a decent working knowledge of the early Seth material and a certain Carlos Castaneda. So this is the foundation upon which he lays his equally prodigious knowledge of UFO literature. Everything from Kehoe, Scully, and Adamski to Vallée, Kant, Hynek, virtually all the principal contact and abduction cases that had been published up to that time. It really is a smorgasbord, basically, for the UFO aficionado. So with these sources, Tansley is easily able to draw various connections between similar kinds of experiences found in mystical occult literature and that of many UFO contactees and abductees. For example, the changes in consciousness, the experiences of various types of light, encountering different kinds of entities, the messages, the experiences of healing or injury. The UFO encounter is the beginning of a personal transformation on the part of the recipient. So these are all the kinds of things that he really tends to focus on. And by the way, as I indicate here, if anyone can actually find a picture, an attributed picture of David Tansley, a Google search didn't reveal a whole lot. And it wasn't what the two pictures came up didn't actually indicate whether they were of him or of someone reading his book or his books, his radionics books more recently. Anyway, Tansley is particularly interested in the relationship between synchronicity and the multi-level symbolism of UFO encounters as a possible interpretive matrix. And he demonstrates the possibilities with his retelling and interpretation of the Skoroton mystery. So this is one of the examples. He actually gives a number of examples, but he spends quite a bit of time on the Skoroton mystery. So to remind everybody what the Skoroton mystery or incident, as it is sometimes called, was an alleged encounter between a man who is alternatively named as Ernest or Arthur Bryant. The reason I say that is because David Tansley calls him Ernest Bryant, but other sources that I've looked at refer to him as Arthur Bryant. So I guess he could be, Ernest Arthur Bryant. But anyway, Mr. Bryant. So it was an encounter between a Mr. Bryant, who was apparently an unassuming man from South Devon in the UK, and a reported extraterrestrial. According to the basic story, what Bryant told, he was just taking a walk. It was kind of like a Woodrow Derenberger kind of encounter. He was taking a walk, and the spaceship landed, and these youngish looking dudes came out. Young men came out, and they didn't look that alien. They looked kind of humanish. And they popped out of this spaceship on April 24th, 1965. And one of them introduced himself to Bryant using the name Yamsky, and then proceeded to provide a whole lot of interesting narrative to Bryant, kind of a lengthy message. There were several other experiences that happened sort of after that. But according to people who knew Bryant, he was not the kind of person that would lie about these things. And Yamsky, that's what he called himself, this message that he delivered seemed to make reference to Desmond Leslie, who of course was a contemporary, someone and another contactee that George Adamski had known, and to Thomas Mantell. And Thomas Mantell had died in 1948. He was a pilot who had died when he had been scrambled to pursue a UFO, and he had he ascended to an altitude that was beyond the oxygen capacity of his plane, and he crashed. This is something that really happened, and the official record is that he crashed. Pursuing Venus. That's kind of the official story there. Now, this encounter was investigated by a woman named Eileen Buckle. She was a UFO investigator, and she had kind of a team with her, and they investigated Mr. Bryant and determined, at least in their book, that his experiences with this individual who came out of a spaceship and identified himself as Yamsky, was real. And they also, or at least the experience was real, and they also did kind of an investigation into the messages that Yamsky gave to Bryant, and concluded that there were some coded messages in there. The most interesting being is that apparently George Adamski himself, the famous contactee, had died the day before this Yamsky fellow appeared before Mr. Bryant. So, putting all this together, Tansley develops his own kind of theory about what's going on. He says, the Scoriton contact bears the following series of messages or hints, if you like. First and foremost, it tells us that Adamski's experiences, no matter how far out they were or how contradictory they seemed, were genuine at the level of reality he had them on. One of the things that Yamsky showed Mr. Bryant was an embroidered robe that seemed to have on it a Rosicrucian symbol. And so he says the embroidered robe with its Rosicrucian emblem stands out as proof that even his wildest claims of attending a council of great cosmic beings were valid. So basically, Yamsky had shown Bryant a symbol that was like the symbol that George Adamski had seen on this robe. Anyway, it shows that other levels of existence are a reality, and that the UFO experience is an aspect of penetration into those levels. Our attention is focused on the relationship between Earth and Venus time and time again, and there is a deep esoteric link between these planets and their inhabitants, which we should become familiar with. So he goes on, and he talks a little bit about how Adamski is connected to Menger and to Orfeo Angelucci. These are also Howard Menger and Orfeo Angelucci. These are also two contactees. To Desmond Leslie. The comment by Yamsky about the importance of the work Desmond Leslie was doing in Sanskrit is a hint to us of the extreme importance, for it is in the works translated from Sanskrit that we will find many of the answers to what we see as the mystery of the UFOs. So he basically, what he does is he kind of goes through all of the revelations that Yamsky told Mr. Bryant, and for him it both confirms on various symbolic levels what George Adamski experienced, but it also, he claims, provides a key for understanding the symbolic content of other UFO encounters. So that it's important to pay attention to certain Sanskrit texts. It's important to pay attention to esoteric materials and mystical materials, and that those will provide the key for understanding why people are having, at least in the 1970s, his view of an increasing number of UFO experiences then or now. Now, to many modern readers, when he recounts this, or many current readers, I should say, when he recounts the Scoriton mystery, I don't know, when I reread it, I mean, I knew about the Scoriton mystery, but when I reread it, it seemed like a psyops exercise. Although granted, why Ernest Bryant would have been chosen for it is anyone's guess. I mean, that's always sort of the trick with those things. Now, Yamsky had said to Bryant that the underlying reason for his contact was that both Adamski and Bryant shared Romany heritage. Okay, but what does that really mean, in light of all of this? Now, of course, one thing he doesn't talk about is the continuing mystery and strange synchronicities that have to do with the name Adamski. There's that curious case of Zygmunt Adamski, an immigrant to the UK who was found mysteriously dead on a West Yorkshire coal pile in 1980 after disappearing for several days, and his appearance was also out of character and very suspicious. Where he had been, how he actually died, and how he ended up on the coal pile, which was not only 10 feet tall, but he was found in broad daylight. And the building that this coal pile was in was not abandoned nor isolated. People were moving in and out of it all the time. So there was like a very limited space of time where he could have been put up there. And who took care of him in the intervening days before his death has never been determined. You know, he had different clothes on, or some different clothes on. He clearly had been fed and taken care of during he was gone for like almost 2 weeks or something. He'd been shaved, so he actually, you know, he was treated well wherever he was, and then he ended up dead on this pile of coal, and no one knows how he got there. He had some kind of a cardiac event, apparently. That's why he died, but when they did an autopsy, they couldn't determine what may have caused the cardiac event. So that's weird enough, and his name is Adamski, but what makes it even weirder is that the detective in West Yorkshire who was chosen to investigate his case, a man named Alan Godfrey, he investigated for 6 months Adamski's case, couldn't figure out anything about it, was completely, flummoxed by it. And then one day when he was called out to investigate some reports of escaped cattle on an estate, he had his own UFO encounter and possible abduction, which completely changed his life. So here we have George Adamski, and then this weird experience by Mr. Bryant, and then another Adamski who disappears and is found dead in odd circumstances, and then the policeman who investigates him has this bizarre UFO experience. It's like a weird book-ended kind of thing. Now, obviously, Tansley doesn't mention Godfrey, for the events in Yorkshire occurred after his book was published, occurred in 1980. But like I said, they seem to form this weird, strange bookend, an odd set of symbolic occurrences that nonetheless appear to involve real people, real cattle, real families, real deaths. Now, all the strange synchronistic connections are true, in other words, he talks about these various synchronicities, though obscure, and they might not seem so strange to us now, because we talk a lot in the paranormal community about synchronicities, at least some of us do. But you have to remember that this book was written about 50 years ago, and during a time when Vallée's speculations were considered to be pretty way out there. Tansley was writing at a time when the nuts and bolts interpretation really held sway, and so his observations were considered probably pretty out there too. But his approach seems far less strange now. There's even an interesting story that he tells in here of a series of UFO sightings and encounters where one of the UFOs does leave some material behind, and what it does is it leaves a pile of nuts and bolts behind, literal nuts and bolts, although of a style that were not common or native to the place that they were deposited. I personally found that hilarious. It's like, yeah, you want your nuts and bolts? Here's your nuts and bolts, So there are some caveats that a critical reader will note now in retrospect. There's some things that'll kind of come up, and you just have to be aware of them that are worth noting. First, he's writing before the discrediting of Carlos Castaneda. So I'm assuming that many of you know that Carlos Castaneda has been discredited, not only as a serial rapist and a serial abuser of women, the women that were under him, but as someone who plagiarized a lot of his shamanic material, his so-called shamanic material, and probably just made a lot of it up out of whole cloth. So his use of Castaneda and the way in which he uses Castaneda to analyze some of the symbolic content, you need to keep that in mind. Now, there are plenty now of reliable shamanic, if you want to call it that way, shamanic or indigenous sources, which can be substituted for the Carlos, and actually to greater effect, since there are long traditions of UFO-like experiences referenced in many indigenous traditions. It being 1977, Tansley is also guilty of remarks that, well, we would call racially insensitive now. It's not that he is too obnoxious, but he does tend to deal in stereotypes some and uses some terminology that is, now we wouldn't use, basically, to describe different ethnic groups. Now, second, so those are, obviously criticisms of the time. Second, the influence of theosophy in his text is often very clear, in that Tansley often tries to make disparate sources say the same kind of thing, which is one of the things that theosophy attempts to do in its efforts towards universalism. And of course, this is in order to make his point that the main and best explanation of the UFO phenomenon is that it is a signal that the human consciousness is growing and evolving into a higher state. He sees it as evidence, he even says this in a couple places, of Alice Bailey's externalization of the hierarchy, so to speak. He's particularly fond of her Cosmic Ray book and summarizes and quotes from it a lot. Thus, for example, he does try to use elements of the Seth material that had been published up to that point and Alice Bailey together to prove that both of these sources are essentially saying the same thing about consciousness, so that he can then apply these ideas to the changes in consciousness and symbolism that's experienced by UFO percipients. So, but basically, if you actually review his quotations in context, he's often cherry picking a little bit. His quotes are sometimes taken out of context, and anyone who is familiar with Bailey and the Seth material knows that the metaphysical conceit behind each is quite different. Still, it is interesting that Tansley knows enough about the Seth material to quote from it. Most paranormal investigators are unaware of the fact that Seth replied to several questions about various paranormal topics, UFOs, Bigfoot, hauntings, possessions, over the course of the years when the material was being produced. Many of his answers were quite provocative, and I may present them in a future episode. So that, for example, one of the things that he does is, this is just an example, when he's talking about the Scoroton mystery, one of the possible explanations during Eileen Buckles' investigation of the Scoroton mystery was that Yamsky represented a kind of reincarnation, if you will, of George Adamski in some way. And for him, for Tansley, this as a possibility, he felt was a symbolic way of saying that you should look at sources that talk about reincarnation seriously. So you should look at things like the Theosophists. You should look at things like the Seth material, because they both talk about reincarnation and they both talk about the different ways in which incarnating souls can manifest. And so this is a different way in which you can interpret what Yamsky is trying to say to Bryant. I don't think Bryant got that from what I could tell, but anyway, of course, what that leaves out is that the theory of reincarnation in the Seth material and in Theosophy are quite different, and actually come from very different metaphysical standpoints. In the Seth material, reincarnation is only apparent. It's because time isn't linear. And in fact, he does use that Seth idea that time isn't linear to talk a little bit about how you can kind of see the multi-level ways in which synchronicity works in a manner that that synchronicity sort of violates linear time. And that's part of the reason why it strikes us so much, which is kind of an interesting way of talking about it. And as part of this, he does have a really interesting take on something that Casey said. One of the things that Edgar Casey said was that in some of his material is that part of the reason why human beings are advancing technologically so much, so quickly, is not so much because we're getting technical information from extraterrestrials, although Edgar Casey doesn't really talk about extraterrestrials, but he does. What Edgar Casey says is that, or one of the things he says is that part of the reason that these, we're having these technological revolutions all the time, through the 20th century up to the present time, is because people who were living in Atlantis are reincarnating now, and they're kind of bringing with them information. But of course, unfortunately, they're also bringing the karma of that, so that we're facing some of the same difficulties. And what Tansley's take on this is that what the UFO experiences might be is that they might be warnings about that. They might be our consciousness trying to warn us that all this reincarnated stuff from Atlantis needs to be done carefully and taken seriously because it can lead to self-destruction. Now, something that he doesn't say, but which I thought about when I was reading this, is you could take this interpretation and you could position it with Seth's assertion in the Seth material that the story of Atlantis doesn't lie in the past, but actually lies in the future. And if you think about it that way, well, that's just interesting to think about. So anyway, those are the kinds of interesting, like, thought experiments that you can engage in when you read this book. So criticisms aside, there are a number of reasons to read this book, if you can get a hold of it. First, it's an easy and fun book to read. Tansley has an engaging narrative style. He tells stories well, and it's really a treat to pick up a book, read a chapter, think about it, and read another chapter. In fact, part of the reason why it took me a while to put this presentation together at all is because there were just so many things. Every time I'd pick up his book and read a piece of it, my mind would wander off and think about things. Second, Tansley does have a treasure trove of previously unpublished accounts, which go a long way in establishing one of his principal arguments for the relationship between the mystical, magical, and esoteric UFO encounter, aspects of the UFO encounter, as I've mentioned, namely the experience of synchronicity, which he focuses on a lot. So those of you who are really into that, this book has a lot about it. In fact, just reading the book triggered a number of synchronistic experiences in my own life that at first seemed unrelated, none of which involved obvious UFO experiences, but which are significant enough that several very profound internal changes have been taking place in my life, leading to external decisions which I've made that may alter my life course. And it's connected to this as the death of my father and a whole bunch of other things. So his attention to this aspect of UFO encounter is worth yours. Third, and this is one of the synchronicities, Tansley dedicates a huge chunk of one chapter to his experiences living in the same basic area of the Tujunga Canyon during the same time period as the women who Ann Druffel worked with or was working with at the time of his publishing this book, as detailed in the Tujunga Canyon Contacts, a book that I reviewed back in 2022, almost exactly 2 years ago. So Tansley had relocated to the Tujunga Canyon region in the early 1950s in order to go to college, eventually study medicine, and then eventually become a chiropractor. He reports on the very rural nature of the canyon at that time and a strange woman who claimed she knew a man who came from outer space. So he first moved there during the time period when those women in the Tujunga Canyon Contacts were having their experiences. Now, through the late 50s and early 60s, Tansley was too, as he puts it, was too involved with his studies to really pay that much attention, although he talks about that these stories were around him a lot. By the early 1960s, he had moved to another part of the canyon, closer to his school. He had gotten married and was a periodic attendee at household parties held by a man named Gene Burroughs, who was an engineer for ABC Network at the time, and at one point assisted in the televising of astronauts during the Apollo missions. Now, Burroughs, this Gene Burroughs, was into UFOs big time, and he claimed to have seen many of them over the canyon, Tujunga Canyon, and the surrounding mountains. Tansley claimed that at the time, like I said, he didn't pay too much attention to any of this because he was too involved in his studies. Although he does admit that he saw something once. He saw that he and his wife had an odd sighting of something, and he didn't realize at the time that this was a type of UFO sighting. It was a sighting that was very similar to the kinds of things that were reported by, let me go look him up. Hold on. I hate this when I have to do this. My brain isn't working. Harley Rutledge in Project Identification. The experience that he had was very similar to some of the daytime sightings that Rutledge talks about, where he sees what appears to be at first like a regular aircraft of some type, and then all of a sudden it starts doing weird stuff. And I think in this instance what it was one of those sightings where you think it's an aircraft and then you realize what it really is it just looks like a bunch of windows. There isn't even really a craft that these windows are attached to. It's just like a bunch of windows that just suddenly opens up. It's very strange. But anyway, later on Tansley realized, oh, I actually had an experience myself. But there was another attendee to Gene Burroughs' parties, his UFO parties, and he was a man named Gene Dorsey. And here we have the name game again, two Genes, who apparently had had many strange sightings himself and paranormal occurrences all of his life. And in fact, in many ways, he was apparently a lot like this Mr. Bryant, in terms of who he was and how he was. According to Tansley, Dorsey was just a simple businessman, very pleasant and unassuming in his manner, who ended up getting involved in all kinds of strange things: UFOs, strange men in suits, disappearances and reappearances of other witnesses, and eventually even met George Adamski. And apparently Adamski actually mentions Gene Dorsey at the end of his book, Flying Saucers Have Landed. Tansley recounts some of Dorsey's reported experiences and wonders why he wasn't so interested at the time, since Dorsey's encounters bear so many of the hallmarks that would fascinate Tansley later on. And one of the things Tansley talks about is, how is it that I'm constantly around this kind of stuff? It's kind of the same sort of question that Peter Levenda has had, like, why is it that I don't have that many weird experiences, but I'm constantly around people who are having weird experiences? What does that really mean? So it's this little bit of history in this book that Tansley recounts. He was able to place the Tujunga Canyon contacts into a larger, proper context, basically. He seems to confirm that many people were seeing things at the time, in that place where a series of women would later report their own experiences. So there are details in this story that interested local historians might be able to investigate further. So, he gives place names, a few individuals, things like that. So people who are interested in the Tujunga Canyon context might be able to go there and sort of have a good time with history. And in fact, while I was reading this book and organizing this blog, I was contacted out of the blue by a young reporter out of LA who wanted to get a few statements from me about my Tujunga Canyon blog, which I did, like I said, a couple of years ago. How's that for a weird synchronicity? So Omens of Awareness is a book worth getting and reading, despite its flaws, which, are mostly due to the times. Tansley was more optimistic about human potential than we are now, so there is a kind of irony in reading his hopes for the future. But there are also moments of jewel-like precision in his analysis that might still prove useful, and some of his personally collected accounts are amazing. So this is just a final quote from his preface. There seems to be a very definite link between esotericism and certain areas of the UFO experience, which I believe, if explored, will lead the individual to an understanding of the world he lives in and will contain a depth and breadth of vision not heretofore known.